Hi everyone, my name's Tharmiha, and today I'll be talking about ethnographic fieldwork. I'd just like to start off with a quick introduction about myself. I was born and raised in the city of Toronto. I'm currently a planner for the City of Toronto's real estate agency, where I work on a number of interesting city building initiatives. I love to travel. This is actually a picture of me during my recent trip to Banff, Alberta. And lastly, I'm most interested in planning issues related to housing affordability, community engagement, and the public realm. Here's a brief overview of what I'll be discussing in my presentation. First, I'll go over what ethnographic fieldwork is and the known origins of this social research method. Next, I'll talk about the strengths and limitations of ethnographic fieldwork. Then, I'll talk about the different stages in field research. I'll then go over the traditional observational continuum, or the roles that an observer can take on when conducting ethnographic fieldwork. Then, I'll outline what to consider when using this research method. I will highlight some best practices of this research method. Lastly, I'll present a few questions that I'd like us all to discuss. Ethnographic fieldwork involves the study of people through qualitative observational research and is commonly known as participant observation or field research. Ethnography refers to the scientific study of customs, cultures, and behaviors of people. Ethnographic fieldwork has been used by researchers to gain an understanding of others, as in people who are different from themselves. Unlike other qualitative research methods, including surveys and focus groups, where a researcher would hear about what people claim to do, ethnographic fieldwork allows an observer to witness the actions of people directly. Because the primary source of data is the researcher's observations, there's much credibility to this research method. Ethnographic fieldwork enables an observer to clearly understand the context of a situation and discover patterns in behaviors over time. As mentioned, ethnographic fieldwork has been a way for researchers to understand others, as in anyone other than themselves. It all started in the 15th and 16th centuries, when European explorers found the New World and discovered the others, who in this case were indigenous peoples. The European settlers found the indigenous culture to be primitive and evaluated the natives against what they believed to be the more superior European standard of living. In the 1940s, prominent researchers began to understand that the others were actually living amongst them. Immigrants, minorities, and people living in slums and ghettos were deemed inferior to the regular Caucasian man, and were studied by many to understand the differences of populations within cities and the course to assimilation. The third moment of ethnographic history was during the 1980s and 1990s, when researchers began to understand that those who used to be considered as the others, mainly African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian people, needed to be represented fairly, and that the different cultures should be explored and celebrated, rather than criticized. Now let's discuss the strengths and limitations of this research method. To start, this research method is reliable, as the primary data source is the observer's own observations. It also enables the observer to know the situation or people rather than to know about them. In terms of limitations, reactivity is a major consideration. How does the observer's presence in the field change how people behave? Representativeness. How was the setting selected? Was it simply convenient and easy to access? Is it a setting that can apply to other societies, or is it an outlier? Limitations of the observer. Are there things the observer fails to understand? Are there biases of the observer that can impact the observations? There may be ethical issues that arise on the role that an observer takes on. I'll discuss this later in the presentation. As Laura C. Johnson outlines in Week 8 of our course, there are multiple steps that need to be considered when conducting ethnographic or field research. First, one must select a setting. Then, the observer must gain access to the setting of research. How can the observer enter a setting? The observer must then decide how to establish roles and develop relationships with those present in the setting of research. How will the observer interact or not interact with those in the field of study? What is his or her reason for being present at the specific setting? What role will they play as the observer? I'll talk more about this particular point in the next section of this presentation. Next, the observer will collect data, take notes, and conduct interviews as needed. This is important to ensure the reliability of the data, as the researcher's observations are the primary set of data for the study. Then the observer will begin to analyze data and make sense of the observations. The observer will eventually have to leave the field. When does one know when the study is complete? How does the observer explain their departure to those in the field? Lastly, the observer will analyze the data and disseminate findings. What are the characteristics of the social phenomenon observed? What are the causes of the social phenomenon? And what are the consequences of that social phenomenon? Palys and Atchison describe the relationships that an observer can take on when conducting ethnographic fieldwork through the traditional observational continuum. I'll be explaining each role, its strengths and weaknesses, and practical advice when partaking in each role. On one side of the continuum is the complete participant. As a complete participant, a researcher is directly involved in the field of study and is able to gain a personalized experience that may not be possible by observing from afar. The observer does not reveal his or her identity as a researcher. The limitation of being a complete participant, however, is how a researcher can cross ethical boundaries due to the lack of informed consent of those being studied. As Palys and Atchison point out, a researcher should consider whether the situation is public or not, whether the data that are gathered involve identifiable persons, and whether publication of one's observations can be done without violating confidentiality, to ensure that those who unknowingly participated in research are nonetheless protected from harm. Another challenge of partaking in this role is how the researcher is unable to step out of the role as participant to record and analyze during the study period. Due to this, a researcher should keep an account of their findings through memos, recordings, and other forms of evidence throughout the process. Lastly, the presence of the researcher in the field can potentially influence another's views. These factors should all be considered before taking on the role of complete participant. On the other hand, the complete observer has the appropriate permissions to observe the selected field of study and does not engage in the field. Additionally, those who are present in the field of study are aware that the researcher is there. One of the biggest limitations of the complete observer is how the presence of the researcher can cause reactivity amongst observed participants, and therefore alter their behavioral patterns. According to Palys and Atchison, there are 4 factors of which a researcher has control over to minimize the conspicuousness of the observer: the characteristics of an observer, the characteristics of the participants, the duration of the observational period, and the rationale of observing. It's clear that there are both strengths and weaknesses when analyzing the 2 extremes of the traditional observational continuum. This is why the continuum also outlines 2 middle roles labeled the participant as observer and the observer as participant. These more neutral roles address the many limitations that come with the complete observer and complete participant roles. Now let's talk about things to consider when conducting ethnographic fieldwork. Lofland explains that the purpose of social science aims to discover 3 things. What are the characteristics, the causes, and the consequences of a social phenomenon? For ethnographic fieldwork, the characteristics that an observer should consider when conducting research include participants. The observer should know the basic demographic of the people being studied. Acts and activities. What's happening? Who does it involve? How can the variety of actions observed be categorized? What patterns are realized? Words and meanings. How does the observer incorporate speech? How do certain words and sayings have specific social meanings? Relationships and networks. As mentioned before, an observer may take on a variety of roles to conduct research, and there are pros and cons to each role. It's important to understand how each role will impact the study and how to effectively use the role to collect reliable observations with the least amount of reactivity. The setting. This is where the observer must decide where a specific hypothesis can be tested. Is a setting open to anyone? How is it accessible? How is a setting perceived by society? And lastly, history. How have past events impacted the society today and caused the actions being observed? It's important to discuss how ethnographic fieldwork has been used by researchers in the past. I'd like to talk about Rojan Mohammadi, who studied the impacts of redevelopment on local market vendors in Iraqi Kurdistan. As a result of redevelopment, merchants of the Delal Khaneh Bazaar were displaced, and Mohammadi conducted field observations and key informant interviews to understand the impacts of displaced merchants. She used field observations to help understand the setting that was being studied, and it also helped to validify what was being said during her key informant interviews. She took on an observer as participant role while conducting research. She revealed to the merchants that she was conducting the research and made sure to provide a brief description of her work. This allowed her to create a trusted relationship between herself and the observed subjects. She would record her notes after conducting each interview to reduce the reactivity of the merchants being interviewed. She would then add observer comments which involved her analysis of the data observed in the research after the fact. Mohammadi also highlighted a number of factors that she needed to consider during her research. For instance, it was important that she followed the cultural dress code when conducting her field observations. It's a social norm for Iraqi women to cover their arms and legs. In order to fit in with the rest of the people at the bazaar and respect the cultural norms, Mohammadi followed this dress code. This is a strong example of how a researcher can prepare for field research in order to ensure a successful study. Another example, and also one of my personal favorites, is about William H. White, who was a renowned urbanist and journalist. He was known for his focus in ethnography, as he often used observatory methods to conduct research. In the 1970s, William White worked with the New York City Planning Commission to study how people used public urban spaces in New York City. His book and film, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, illustrated how parks, plazas, playgrounds, and city blocks were being used by society. Over a span of 10 years, White diligently studied pedestrians in New York City using a number of research methods. His main technique, however, was simple, direct observation to describe human behavior in public settings. To support his study, his team used cameras to record human behavior for long periods of time, while also sending out different members of his team to physically be with those they were observing. It's clear that his team used a mix of roles to conduct their research. White analyzed how different factors affected how people would use a public space. Users would usually change their behavior depending on sun and shade levels, the availability of movable furniture, the relationship between the plaza and the street, food, other people, and much more. White described situations of when his team needed to pause their research or omit some of their observed data due to potential ethical issues, respecting people's privacy, and accidentally capturing illicit activities. While the study can be considered somewhat dated, the findings of White's research are still applicable to planning issues today, and many cities have adopted his criteria for successful open spaces ever since. Thank you all for listening to my presentation. I'd love to discuss your thoughts on ethnographic fieldwork. Please take a look at the 2 questions I put together for us to discuss. I'm looking forward to your responses. The first question is, you want to observe the relationship between different users, vehicles, cyclists, and pedestrians, of a busy intersection to understand what measures are needed to ensure safety for all users. How do you think ethnographic fieldwork can be used for your research? The second question is, can you think of any considerations that a researcher should contemplate other than what was presented?